Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical.
Episode 1, Frances Who?
This podcast is a story, or a set of stories, about Frances Wright, reformer, philosopher, writer, activist, abolitionist before it was cool, and feminist long before the word existed.
We're starting from the end of Frances's life, at her resting place in Cincinnati's idyllic Spring Grove Cemetery. Earlier this year, we went there and searched for her grave, a worn obelisk shaded by a tree.
So do you want to read the inscription?
Yeah, sure. As much as I can. Frances Wright, fique Paul d'Arrosmont, born Dundee, Scotland, September 6th, 1795, died Cincinnati, Ohio, December 13th, 1852. I have wedded the cause of human improvement.
Yes.
Passed on it. Is that right?
We're staked
on it. My fortune, my reputation, and my life. Frances Wright, 1820. I can't see the last digit. It's a little bit lichen-y.
18 looks like 29 or 28.
And that's an interesting moment.
Yeah.
Do you want to read the last part?
I can try. Humankind is but one family. The education of its youth should be equal and universal.
Frances Wright d'Arrosmont.
Yep.
18 lichen.
40 lichen. Oh, that was a great year.
We may have started from the end, but Wright's story hasn't ended. We're still living it in our daily discussions of who is a woman and what women should be, of sex and morality, of who belongs here and who's a real American, of who can speak up and who had better keep quiet.
It's these burning questions that inspired us to dig into this story, the story of a woman who was infamous and inspiring to generations of Americans, but who has been forgotten in our tales of the American past. Over the next 8 episodes, you'll hear insightful conversations with scholars whose work illuminates why Wright still matters. You're going to hear how Americans have been arguing about gender, class, and economic inequality, race, citizenship, and belonging from the very beginning of our republic. Let's hear how Frances Wright herself talked about how she became the thinker she was in a letter to a friend.
I can recall from infancy a strong love of truth and a desire to investigate all opinions. In my infancy, I drew conclusions in opposition to all I saw around me. The haughtiness of aristocrats disgusted me with aristocracy. The bad feelings and clumsy reasonings of religionists led me to examine religion, and habits of study and observation added to a consciousness of internal rectitude with an unusual portion of moral and mental energy, make me fearless in promulgating truths when they are firmly established in my mind.
So, Tristra, what is it about Frances Wright's life and work that captured your fascination?
Well, I can basically remember the first time I encountered Frances, and it was in a really weird spot. So there's this little green space next to one of Indiana's oldest still operating libraries, the Working Men's Institute in New Harmony, Indiana. And there was a plaque that said, oh, this is where this one building used to stand and the Owen brothers used to live here, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah. And this was also the home of Frances Wright. I was like, who's Frances Wright? So being, I Googled her and landed on a Wikipedia page that blew my mind. This was this woman who had come to the U.S. and who had, written a groundbreaking book in her late teens and become friends with some of the world's most notable philosophers and revolutionaries at the time. And she was quite radical in her views at the time and might even be considered radical by some today. She advocated free thought, free love, and more or less a rational debate about extremely touchy subjects that ran the gamut from race to religion. But she was still, the thing that was so interesting about her, and I think is really helpful for us now is to think about her in terms of where she came from, and that was the Enlightenment. And because of her deep roots in the Enlightenment, and specifically in the Scottish Enlightenment, she really admired reason above all, and she had a lot of love for this sort of vision of a classical philosophical world that is perhaps feels a little bit exotic to us now, but that was very, very important to the first folks who started to formulate the idea of America, an idea that I think still matters to us, even if we don't realize it or admit it. She was also, she was this woman who was willing to experiment with her life and to live under really difficult conditions, even though she came from a very wealthy background. I mean, like a lot of revolutionaries and activists, and, like Karl Marx would be a great example. You come from privilege, but you're willing to get down and do the difficult work side by side with people less privileged than you. So I thought that was really, really inspiring. Of course, the more you know about someone, the more complicated they become. And we are definitely not here to romanticize Frances with this podcast. But I think it's really important to see the great contrasts and really exciting stuff that at first glance, you're like, wow, this was an incredible human being. Why didn't I ever hear about her?
Yeah, so it sounds like she was known and admired by people like Walt Whitman, the Marquis de Lafayette, Jeremy Bentham, the British political philosopher. Why should people care now if she's been forgotten?
That's a really good question. So in some ways, if you look at Wright's life, you can see the beginnings of many, many of the conversations and arguments and screaming matches, frankly, we're having right now. So if someone tries to imagine America as a place that at some point everyone all agreed or everyone was all the same, they're kind of pulling the wool over your eyes. America's a place where we have always been contentious, opinionated, divided, and outspoken people. In fact, that was something I think a lot of British travelers noted when they came in the early 19th century about how we're just a mouthy, yelly, screamy bunch of people with a lot of feelings. And so Wright definitely felt at home in that kind of milieu. And she liked to stir the pot. She did it in a very kind of dignified way, but she had her opinions and she would stand by them. And so some of her opinions are pretty striking. So she was anti-slavery. She was very much an abolitionist before the organized national abolitionist movement that I think we can really credit to about the 1840s or so. But she was and so she's a good person to look at if you're interested in those early anti-slavery efforts to organize, or disorganize against slavery. She also was very, very outspoken about women's intellectual abilities and that it was necessary for women to participate in public life. Again, these sound like kind of no-brainers to us at the moment for most of us. However, this was before anyone was really speaking about this very publicly. She kind of falls into this interesting space between really early pioneers of Western, women's rights thinking like Wollstonecraft and the later sort of what we would consider the first wave of feminism. So not to get too deep in the historical lady weeds, but she really has this interesting position. And again, it shows that these arguments and these debates and these questions we're all asking or trying to figure out have deep roots in American culture. So, yeah.
All right. You've convinced me. I want to learn more.
That was easy.
Let's dive in.
Well, first, I think we need to get at sort of a big sweeping view of Frances Wright's life and her work. And we found probably one of the best people to do this, and that is Dr. Cheryl Coulthard, who has been researching Wright, and in particular, her community at Neshoba, which we'll go into a lot in later episodes. She's currently working on a new bio of Frances Wright, and she basically walks us through some of the best highlights of Frances's life. And I think folks will start to get an idea of who this person was. We caught up with her at the Communal Studies Conference in the historical utopian community of New Harmony, and a place that you've probably heard. This is the second time New Harmony's come up. It's going to come up a lot in this podcast.
This will not be the last time.
Yeah, so if you're a New Harmony stan, you've come to the right place.
If we have a bingo card for this podcast, New Harmony is on it for sure.
It's probably the it's the main one, because if you get, anyway. So here, let's talk to Cheryl, and she will give us a wonderful introduction to Frances Wright's life.
So, you explained that you came across Frances Wright early in your graduate career. What drew you to her story?
I have been, ever since I first came across her, I was absolutely fascinated because she was, for her time period, because she's pre the suffrage movement and pre the first wave feminist movement, really. I mean, she's between Wollstonecraft and Anthony, but she was so out there. And when you read her speeches she was giving, they sound so modern because she was talking about equality for everyone and talking about the importance of education based on facts, not the Bible, not opinions, not, old dead guys, but what can you verify for yourself, critical thinking, those sorts of things that are such a big deal right now. And she was talking about them in the 1820s. And that just blew me away. And the more I dig into her, the more fascinating I find her. And everybody I know, when they hear about her, are just blown away and become totally obsessed with it.
I think that's our experience. Can you tell us some specific aspects or moments of Frances Wright's life that you find most compelling?
Well, as I said, her passion for equality. She was a woman that had all the privilege, and yet she dedicated her life to helping people that were marginalized. So enslaved people, immigrants, working class people, women, particularly women in difficult marriages and that sort of thing. And her I recognize it sometimes comes off a bit as, white saviorism, but she was genuinely trying to help people. And she knew that she had resources and privileges that made it easier for her to do that. And just her willingness to confront gender norms and societal expectations, even when it meant that she was physically threatened. And she was just so abused in the press. And she just carried on and just brushed that off. And that really impressed me about her.
So here, we've got a whole list of questions that you prepared for, so we should probably...
That's okay.
So I wanted to ask the white saviorism is a really great way to put it. In general, it's so interesting because on one hand, she's, kind of the big precursor. She's sort of like the intersectionality OG.
Yeah. Yes.
And on the other hand, there's a deep paternalism that is very much a product of her era. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, as much as you feel comfortable, about that sort of reformer ethos and how it impacted the way Frances Wright articulated some of her views.
So she's interesting because she precedes a lot of the big reform movements like temperance and prison reform, asylum reform, that were such big things as we move into the kind of middle to late 19th century. But she was very deeply concerned about when she came to the United States, and her previous very rose-colored glasses image got shattered when she went to the South and she saw slave markets and that sort of thing. And that just, I think, was really moving to her and shocking because she didn't realize that was a part of American society. And obviously Robert Owen's influence in terms of looking at working class people. I think because she was very wealthy and well educated, there's a certain amount of noblesse oblige, and the idea that if you have money, maybe you should use some of that to help the less fortunate. So that, I think, is part of her cultural conditioning. But I think she's also part of that Owenite movement that is really looking at bottom-up organizing, expanding suffrage, expanding workers' rights, even if there's still that very paternal aspect to it. And it's hard to get away from, I guess, being paternal if you've got the wealth and you're trying to help people. And they never really thought about talking to those people and saying, so what are your concerns? How can we best help you or best empower you to help yourself? That really wasn't part of the conversation in those days. And that's why it comes across tone deaf to modern ears. At the time, it wouldn't have been seen that way.
So I wanted to ask about the new biography you're working on, and especially what's kind of driven you to bring us a new biography. What have past biographers missed? What do you want to add to the conversation about Frances Wright?
So there's kind of three major biographies about them. Two are from the 1920s. There's Waterman and then Perkins and Wolfson. And then the next main biography ever doesn't show up until the 1980s. Celia Morris Eckhart's book. My favorite is actually Waterman's. Even though it was written in the 1920s by a man, it's the least sexist, which was really weird to me. I thought that was really odd that as a man writing in the 1920s about a radical woman, that he's more, I guess, understanding, more even-handed. I find the other two books are rather judgmental, particularly about her personal life, her relationships, that sort of thing. The judgments of, well, when she got married, of course she quit working. Why would she continue being an activist? Or she didn't really do anything after she got married, which isn't true when you look at the historical record. I think it's time we need to reconsider Wright as a feminist, even though she preceded that big mid-19th century first wave feminism. Although I think it was Anthony had a picture of Frances Wright on the wall in her study. And there's a picture of her in the history that they wrote about that movement at the time. So she was obviously an influence, even though she wasn't really interested in suffrage as a way towards equality. I think she needs to be reconsidered as a woman who, for the most part, put career before romantic relationships and motherhood and the costs that exacted on her, and to better situate her within the reform movements of her time and the paternalistic, as we were saying, and sometimes classist and racist assumptions of those groups. I think that needs to be made a little more complex. We need to dig into that a little more.
Interesting. And we were able to hear a paper you gave yesterday on Frances Wright. I was really struck by something you mentioned about rethinking Robert Dale Owen's influence on her, or her influence on Robert Dale Owen.
Actually, Robert Owen.
Oh, sorry, Robert Owen.
The father. Because often historians say, oh, well, as a woman, of course, there was a man behind the scenes controlling what she was doing and her thoughts.
Yeah.
And she's generally classed as an Owenite, which I think is fair. Robert Owen had a huge influence on the broader movements in Britain, particularly at the time, but also in the way people were thinking about workers' rights and working conditions, because this is the era where industrialization is really taking off. You've got more women and children working in an industrial environment. A lot of concerns about men and women working together and the proprieties of that. And he was really thinking about how important environment is for people working in his factories and what he could do to make life better for them, partly, but also make them better workers. So there's kind of a vested interest for him in it in terms of profitability. But I think, yes, she spent time at New Harmony, and she spent a lot of time talking with Robert Owen and then his son, Robert Dale. But a lot of her ideas show up in her very early writings and come from her influences. Her father's library was quite radical, and she met people that knew her father because her parents died when she was young, and she went to live with far more conservative relatives. But you can see in her early writings that she was already quite radical, very, I often use the word libertarian, which I don't mean it in the modern sense, but more that she was very concerned about equality and freedoms for everybody. And that shows up pre-Owen. So I think that needs to be reconsidered and just more emphasis put on her as an individual thinker and a free thinker. And she herself foregrounds her kind of investigative work, right? That she goes to thinkers of the day and asks them about what's going on in, especially in those American tours, that she's really evidence gathering.
She's not just sitting at the feet of great men. She's evidence gathering for her.
Well, and the great men are actually important here because my first paper I wrote on her early in first year of grad school was looking at her correspondence. And there's this woman in her early 20s, and she is corresponding and visiting and being treated as a peer by men like Jeremy Bentham and the Marquis de Lafayette, who she had a long relationship with until his kids kind of interfered with that. But also Jefferson and Madison and Andrew Jackson and Sam Houston. She was talking to all of these people, and they were treating her as a peer after she published her first book as a 19-year-old. Like, what woman in that time had that kind of access and respect as a thinker? It's really kind of wild.
I was going to ask, since we're talking a bit about Owen and Owenite communities, I'm curious if you could give us a bit more context about why did Frances Wright, in your opinion, seem to want to pursue this via a communal living experiment versus just there could be other means and other methods that you could use to say, improve the lot of the enslaved or undermine the institution of slavery. Why all live together?
That's a good question, because she had never lived in community before. So I guess first maybe start with, we're talking about the early American Republic. So roughly 1820 to 1850 is when she was active. She's British. She first came to the US as a 19-year-old, did this visit in the North, staying with wealthy friends, didn't really see much. The next visit she went to the South, and that's where she became familiar with the idea of enslavement and plantations. She had a really practical bent, I think, in a lot of ways. So she sat down with enslavers, so friends of people like Jefferson and Madison, and talked to them about, so what are your concerns about ending slavery? And one of their big concerns was financial, because their enslaved people were a capital investment. And if you get rid of that, they lose a lot of money. Plus, they're losing all their labor force. So in thinking about ways to end slavery, she was trying to create a model that enslavers could look at and say, oh, hey, I could adapt that and make that work on my plantation. And she put together a financial plan and a prospectus, and that got published before she even set up the community. But she was really trying to, I think, bridge between concerns about how to help enslaved people, but also to do it in a practical way, because she recognized that you can't go to all these enslavers and just say, end slavery, give up your wealth, because they're not going to go for that.
It sounds, in retrospect, it's hard not to see it as an attempt to avoid cataclysm, as an attempt to avoid a military solution, which is the context in which the end of slavery in America did happen. And I think from our perspective, it's really hard to sit with the idea of coolly and calmly coming up with an economic transaction for something so abhorrent.
Right. And the gradualism, that was contentious at the time, even once abolition really got going. But in the 1820s, abolition, as we think of it, was not really a big thing yet. There were people thinking about, we need to get rid of this institution. It's problematic as a human cost issue, and trying to work through it. But they were also very concerned, and with very racist, white supremacist reasons for it, that we couldn't just take these thousands and thousands of enslaved people, free them and dump them into white society. They were concerned about their safety, particularly in states like South Carolina, where enslaved people greatly outnumbered white people. They were concerned about how that would affect the economy, whether they would displace white workers. And they were concerned about how to culturally accommodate all those enslaved people. So the solution of the American Colonization Society, which was kind of the big group at the time, was, we'll just ship them to Africa without talking to them about whether this was a good idea, without considering whether they had the skills to live in that way. Because if you were, for instance, an urban Black person working in, I don't know, as a sailor or a shipbuilder or something. That's not necessarily a practical skill set to have in Africa. Many of those people had been born in the US and their family had been in the US for generations, so they had no real connection. They wouldn't know the language necessarily. It didn't consider that they came from all kinds of different countries and cultures. So that was like the epitome of paternalism and really white supremacy, because their concern was, well, we can't have them be part of white society, so let's just ship them back to Africa. So Frances Wright, to me, is important because she has hope and a vision that these formerly enslaved people could be part of white society, that all they needed was some education, and for white society to kind of overcome its prejudices. But this was something that was doable. She, unlike the American colonization society, didn't look at them. There's no way they can be part of society. She was very hopeful, and that really sets her apart for me.
In some ways, it seems like she doesn't see enslaved people of African heritage as the problem. She sees the system as the problem.
Right. Absolutely.
And it's very, very interesting with Neshoba how, living side by side. I mean, maybe the communal arrangement was less important than the let's all live side by side, but a communal setup was probably your best bet in the wilds of Western Tennessee at the time.
So like a lot of communal societies, she chose a frontier area because that gets you away from prying eyes and allows you a little more privacy and safety to try out alternative arrangements and do things that are maybe a little more out there that the neighbors might not be so keen on if they knew about. And going into it, I don't think some of the things that happened at Neshoba were ever part of her plan. It just kind of happened. And I think she was trying to, communally, her idea with Neshoba was get these people together so they can start seeing each other as people, and cohabiting would help them break down those barriers and help the white people overcome their prejudices, and the Black members look at, understand better how white people related to each other and culturally how they worked. And then there was the whole economic aspect of it, of essentially Neshoba was a plantation because she was bringing enslaved people there, but the idea was they would work off their purchase price and then they would be freed and then set up to live independently.
It sounds like it's an attempt to move away from a kind of an adversarial relationship that even in like the most rosy colored myths of the old South, you can't get away from the fact that they're basically groups that see each other as enemies.
Well, and the power dynamic. Right. They're not living together side by side as equals. And that was a problem at Neshoba, is even though they're living side by side, they're working side by side, eating, that sort of thing. They're still enslaved people. And they're not given a choice about being there. They're not given a choice about what they do. They didn't have a lot of power in that community or even voice.
Well, let's see. Can you tell us a little bit about the communities that inspired Frances Wright and Neshoba? And well, we've already gone into some of the reasons.
A little bit about New Harmony. She was also influenced by the original iteration here in New Harmony of the Harmonists. Of the Harmonists. And I think she had an ongoing correspondence with Frederick Rapp, that would have been an interesting conversation to overhear. But he, like her, had a super practical bent. That's something about the Rappites I really appreciate. They're Swabians. And Swabians are some of the most practical people you will ever meet. I was an exchange student there as a teenager, actually not far from where Georg Rapp is from. Yeah. I know where he was put on trial in Ludwigsburg. Anyway, we'll take all this out. But no one needs to know about my experience as a teenager in Ludwigsburg, Germany. But they also had a seriously practical bent. They were really into just making things work well. So talk to us a little bit about your perspective on other influences of communal life on Frances.
So Frances went around and visited other communities. And as you said, the Harmonists was a group she visited and corresponded with. And they were very, very different in that they were a religious community with a charismatic, authoritarian, patriarchal leader. And if you look at the Harmonist writings about those meetings, they were in favor of her ideas with Neshoba. They were in favor of racial equality and that. But they had the same reservations about Frances Wright that they had about Robert Owen, and that is that they didn't have a religious foundation to their community. They didn't have those values. And because of that, they felt it wasn't going to work for them. And ultimately, to some extent, that's true. Robert Owen's community, New Harmony, was really more of a think tank for
that's such a great way to put it. I love it.
Reform and utopian ideas. He famously put ads in the paper and said, "Hey, are you interested in this?" And he brought what he called the boatload of knowledge to New Harmony. And it was a group of thinkers, which is great, having that think tank, if you've got the funding and the infrastructure to support it. But they were trying to live as a self-contained community, and nobody wanted to do the hard work needed to keep the community running.
You just don't need a conchologist at first, right?
Right.
Like not
Exactly.
your first profession you want to attract.
It's great that they particularly had a lot of innovators in education and in the sciences, which is great. But when somebody needs to dig an outhouse or harvest crops, those aren't the people you go to. And everybody that was there was much more interested in spending their time on their intellectual pursuits than on the hard work that was needed to keep it going. And that's not an unusual problem and downfall. And then there was, because they didn't have a kind of central group of values and ideals and goals as a community, it was hard to kind of keep everybody together because everybody was there for their own reasons. Whereas the Harmonists, so they founded the community of New Harmony and they sold it to Robert Owen in 1825. And the Harmonists were religious, they were pietists, they were German immigrants. They came over in 1805. They went to Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. They founded the original town there of Harmony. They set up farms. They set up industries like they had woolen mills and a silk industry. And they made shoes and furniture and all kinds of stuff. But they were very religious. They had one man, George Rapp, telling them, this is your, what your beliefs are and you must conform. They were celibate, but they managed to last 100 years and they were incredibly wealthy.
Wow, that was an amazing whirlwind introduction to the woman whose life and work we'll be exploring over the next few weeks.
In the next episode, we'll dive into Frances Wright, the author and writer, and ask why women wrote in this era when women were discouraged from expressing their opinions publicly or, frankly, even having opinions on politics and society at all.
We'll be dropping episodes every 2 weeks from here on out. Readings in this episode were by Emily McGee.
Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical is a co-production of New Year Media and Her Reputation for Accomplishment, written and hosted by Eleanor Rust and Tristra Yeager.
Made possible by a grant from the Working Men's Institute, New Harmony, Indiana, and by the generosity of the Ephraimson Family Fund. Thanks also to the Bloomington Area Arts Council for supporting this podcast.
Music by Eleanor Dubinsky. Editing and audio support by Josh Perez. See you next time.